While the late Nelson Mandela is the figure known for liberating South Africa from the racist apartheid government, one country provided massive support in these efforts. On the phone to discuss Cuba's role in supporting South African freedom is Dr. Piero Gleijeses. He is a professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University. His new book, Visions of Freedom, looks at archival sources in the U.S., Cuba, and South Africa to shed light on that part of history. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Many in the U.S. mourned the death of Nelson Mandela, but few are aware of his reverence for Fidel Castro and Cuba. Could you discuss Cuba's relationship with the African National Congress and their support for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa?
Cuba is the only country in the world that sends its soldiers to fight against apartheid South Africa. And the two critical moments are 1975-76 and 1988. In 1975, Angola, a former Portuguese colony, was slated to be independent on November 11, 1975. There was a war between two camps. One, the MPLA movement, which had been supported historically by the Cubans, the Soviets, and the other two movements that were supported by the United States and South Africa. And the MPLA was winning the civil war. And in order to crush the MPLA, in October 1975, South African troops invaded Angola from Namibia, which was ruled by South Africa. And they would have taken Luanda and they would have crushed the MPLA if the Cuban government had not decided to intervene, to respond with troops. And between November 1975 and April 76, 36,000 Cuban soldiers arrived in Angola. And they forced the South Africans to retreat. It was the first time in living memory that the army of apartheid had been forced to retreat. And they were forced to retreat by a non-white army, because the Cuban army was not a white army. And this had an immense psychological impact in Southern Africa.
Could you briefly touch on the roots of the Latin American Revolution arriving to Africa, for example, with the role of the revolutionary Che Guevara?
Yes. Che Guevara went in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in December 1964. He didn't go as an individual. He went as the representative of the Cuban government. The Cuban government believed in late 64 that Central Africa was ready for revolution. And Che Guevara went to look at the situation. And in Central Africa, first in Congo-Brazzaville, and then in Tanzania, he established contact with the independence movement of Africa, with the MPLA of Angola, and the Cubans started helping the MPLA in 1965 with Frelimo, the liberation movement of Mozambique, with Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the liberation movement of Guinea-Bissau, with the leaders of the revolt in the former Belgian Congo.
Dr. Gleijeses, let's put a pause real quick on Cuba and go to the Soviet Union. Could you give us a quick summary of what the involvement of the Soviet Union was in South African freedom?
Yes, overall it was a very positive role. Before 1975, before the Cubans arrived, the only ones who were really giving military training to the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela were the Soviets. This training was done in the Soviet Union. When Cuba decided to send troops in November 1975 to stop the South African invasion, Cuba did it without consulting the Soviet government. Because at that moment, Brezhnev was obsessed by the idea of the SALT II treaty with the United States. And Fidel Castro understood that Brezhnev would not have supported this issue. But after 2 or 3 months in which the Soviets did not give any assistance, the Cubans sent their troops on their own old planes without logistical support from the Soviet Union from the first couple of months, the Soviet Union relented and got involved in supporting what we could call the Cuban enterprise in Angola. And to quote from President Dos Santos, the president of Angola, what he once told Fidel Castro, the great role of the Soviet Union was to help the Cubans to help Angola. Because the Cuban army that remained in Angola until 1991 was armed with Soviet weapons. The Soviets were the lifeline of the Cubans. Cuba could have made by itself this effort in Angola for a few months, but Cuba could not have maintained an army in Angola for 15 years without the support of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet bloc were the only countries that gave weapons to those who fought for freedom in Southern Africa. The Scandinavians gave very important economic aid, but they didn't cross that line. And the United States was absurd because even the liberals in the United States, take Senator Ted Kennedy. Senator Ted Kennedy made a very publicized trip to Southern Africa in 1985. And Senator Ted Kennedy went to Lusaka, where you had headquarters of the African National Congress, and he felt the right and the duty to lecture the leaders of the ANC and castigate them because they were resorting to armed struggle, which I always found completely absurd. How could Americans who glory themselves in their fight for independence against England, which was a very generous rule compared to apartheid South Africa, how could Americans dare to criticize the ANC because of its armed struggle? But in this country, in terms of the political elites, it is only the Black Caucus, which represents the black members of Congress, which beginning in 1976 supported the rights of the African people of the ANC to fight for the liberation of South Africa. Otherwise, no one.
Well, let's talk finally about the role of the U.S. and Cuba today. As we all know, the world just honored the life of Nelson Mandela, and that included the United States. If they can honor the freedom of South Africa and the fight against the apartheid government, why can they not recognize Cuba's role in this struggle for freedom?
Well, the American political elites are not very generous people. Let me backtrack a second. The United States is still continuing with the savage policy of the embargo. It's essentially the economic blockade of Cuba. And when one talks of this embargo, in reality it goes well beyond the U.S. refusal to trade with Cuba, except under very onerous conditions. The United States applies heavy pressure on third countries not to trade with Cuba, violating international law in the process. So you can understand that the government which behaves in this way would have immense problems in recognizing the role of Cuba for the liberation of Southern Africa, and also for a very simple reason. Cuba played a decisive role in the liberation of Southern Africa against the best efforts of the United States to prevent it. What Cuba did in Southern Africa was the defeat of U.S. policy. Obama does not bear responsibility for this, but it was the policy of the U.S. government. So in order to honor the role of Cuba in Southern Africa, they would have to give a sober assessment of what has been the role of the United States. And the United States elites are not mature enough to do it.
Dr. Piero Gleijeses, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gleijeses is a professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. This is Brittany Peterson for the Voice of Russia in Washington.